Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Preparing for FLSA Overtime Change. My name is Pragya Madan. I'm the Program Manager for HR Consulting Services here at 501 Commons. 501 Commons' mission is to boost the capacity of nonprofit organizations to thrive over the long term and effectively serve the community. Since 1989, we have supported the success of nonprofits in Washington State by providing management, human resources, technology consulting, along with contracted HR, finance, and technology support services. 501 Commons offers leadership development through coaching services and training. Our newest offering, 5 Elements of a Healthy Nonprofit Self-Assessment. This free tool assesses the health of your organization using a set of standards for each of the 5 elements: governance and board, fundraising and financial management, communications and relationships, planning, technology and administration, management and culture. To access this free assessment, visit www.501commons.org. We're happy to have this opportunity to share about the Fair Labor Standards Act and give more specific information about the final overtime rule. As you may already know that on May 18, 2016, the U.S. Labor Department announced overtime final regulations that, when it goes into effect on December 1st, 2016, will mean that most employees earning less than $47,500 per year or $913 per week will be entitled to overtime compensation, regardless of whether they are currently classified as executive, administrative, or professional workers. Today's webinar is designed to help you understand the FLSA, address common questions such as travel and training time, and share strategies for communicating these changes in your organization. A few considerations. All participants are muted to avoid any interruption. You are encouraged to send your questions using the questions feature. We will address as many questions as possible in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Now let me introduce the speakers for today. Mike Harrington, co-chair of Labor and Employment Practice Group at Helsel Fetterman, provides strategic, practical counsel that keep employers in compliance and out of court. With over 20 years of experience working with human resource departments, Mike focuses his practice on labor and employment issues affecting the workplace. He has had broad experience on issues of discrimination and retaliation, employee handbook policies, wage and hour issues, health benefit plan design, and compensation issues. Our second presenter is Efrat Hurwitz, HR consultant, 501 Commons. She has been engaged with a diverse group of nonprofit organizations as a consultant and a partner. She works with the leadership team, supervisors, and staff on all aspects of employee lifecycle. Most recently, she has been advising nonprofits on FLSA compliance, planning, and changes. Efrat holds an MBA with an emphasis on organizational development from Haifa University, Israel, and earned a nonprofit management certificate from the University of Washington in 2014. Now, over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Pragya. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to make sure that we have the ability to move through these slides okay. So we're going to be talking about what folks need to be doing by December 1st. And regardless of the election results, the short term is going to have to be, you need to be in compliance. Long term, we can maybe speculate about what changes might be coming down the road, or maybe an exemption for really small business. But for now, December 1st is the date, and we've known about it for 6 months, so we need to dive in. So the impact is anticipated to be about 7,600 people, or 76,000 people in the state of Washington, and I'm sure a lot of them are represented by the folks on this webinar. So I think it'd be best to talk about what actually changed, and as we recall, that's the salary basis test. And for the most part, the salary basis test is half of the tests that we apply to determine whether or not somebody can be exempt or hourly. And so keeping in mind that the white collar exemptions are these 5 classifications. The first 3 are the main ones: the executive, the administrative, and professional. Outside sales and computer professional exemptions, special considerations for those, and generally we deal with those on a case-by-case basis. But the top 3 are the most common exemptions that we talk about. And let's talk about what that key change is to the salary test. As Pragya mentioned, we are going to $47,476 a year, or rounded to $47,500 a year. Okay, and the last time this was changed was over 12 years ago, and the current rate is $23,660. So I think we can all agree that a change was in order. Most wages, nobody has wages that are stagnant for over 12 years. And so the rate's going up to, has to be a minimum of $913 a week. And not an average, but at least $913 every week. And I talked about before, these are the 3 key classifications, most common exemptions. And so let's focus a little bit on those. As we talked about before, there's a salaries test and there's a duties test. And this duties test is the other half of this equation. These tests have not changed. There was discussion about changing those, and in California there is some state laws regarding this, but up here in the Northwest that's not necessarily the case. And certainly at the federal law, or at the federal level, the duties test has stayed the same. However, the key change in this area is it's now a key area for Department of Labor enforcement, meaning if you call somebody exempt and even if you're paying them $47,500 a year, if they do not meet the duties tests, you fail. Okay, and the Department of Labor is going to be stepping up their enforcement in this area. Let's review the duties tests for the 3 most common areas, because it's not just about changing the dollars, but you actually have to look at the duties. So for the executive duties, either the executive exemption, the primary duty, not partial, not sometimes, not 1 day a week, is managing the enterprise. Okay, this is big, kind of high level, I'm in charge of the enchilada here. So or a subdivision of the enterprise. Okay, usually the test includes directing the work, meaning supervising at least 2 or more other full-time people. Okay, so what the Department of Labor says, it's difficult to be an executive unless you're actually supervising people. Okay, another part of this test is take a look at what your authority is. Do you have the authority to hire and fire? Do you have the authority to promote people? Do you have the authority to advance people in their careers? And if not the direct authority, do you have high-level weight given to your suggestions? Okay, so that's the executive duties test. And again, that's usually a pretty straightforward test. We can tell when somebody's an executive or not. Now the administrative duties, administrative exemption test is an area where we see a lot of misclassifications. Keep in mind that to meet the duties test of an administrative exemption, you have to meet the $47,500 a year, plus you are doing performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the organization. Okay, so this is not being an executive assistant or administrative assistant. It is actually exercising discretion, independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. That does not mean I'm determining what somebody's, I'm putting stuff on calendars, making sure that calendars get juggled properly. The Department of Labor does not consider that to be a matter of significance, even though you or I might think, I don't know how I could get along without that. But it needs to be independent discretion and matters of significance. Here's some areas, for example, that functional areas. Remember, it has to be non-manual labor. These kind of working in the general business operations of tax, accounting, auditing department, and insurance, purchasing and procurement, advertising, human resources, computer networks, and then also legal and regulatory compliance. Those types of activities may meet the administrative duties tests. Now let's talk about the professional duties tests. This area is also another much more clearly defined area. It requires advanced knowledge, and that means you cannot generally meet the professional duties test without having a college degree. So in addition, so it's predominantly intellectual in character and includes work requiring exercise of discretion and judgment. So it's, high level responsibility. The advanced knowledge must be in a field of science or learning and customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. This means generally, unless you have gone to received a college degree or an advanced degree on this thing, you generally will not meet the professional duties test. Okay? There are some exceptions, limited to very case-by-case analysis. But let's take a further look here. Professional employee uses that knowledge to analyze and interpret, make inductive reasoning from various facts and circumstances. They make conclusions and deductions. The advanced knowledge cannot be attained at the high school level, and that is directly off of the Department of Labor's website. Here's some examples: law, medicine, theology, accounting, engineering, architecture. Generally, occupations that have a recognized professional status and are distinguishable from the mechanical arts or tradesmen or skilled trades, construction trades, for instance, and the knowledge has to be of the advanced type. So like I said, we usually don't run into much confusion in this area. So, duties test and the dollars test, or salary basis test, and the duties test together, both sides of the equation have to be met. So, by December 1st, hopefully you have audited your employee pay to make sure that they meet the salary basis test, make sure that they meet the duties test, and then keep in mind that there's absolutely no requirement that even if they meet these tests that they have to be exempt. Even if they qualify, you can continue to pay them on an hourly basis. Let's look at a few areas where we get a lot of questions. And these are going to be with regard to what about salaried, non-exempt employees? And then what is compensable time? How do I count for non-exempt employees the 40 hours a week? And then how do I pay for seminars or training and travel? And then maybe some areas where we've seen some problems when we've been working with employers on this. So what about salaried non-exempt? Well, this is a situation where you pay somebody or you tell them you're going to pay them the same amount even though they do not meet the requirements for an exempt employee. Keep in mind, though, at the end of each work week, by law, state and federal, you still have to be able to prove that the employees received at least the equivalent of minimum wage for every hour worked and got overtime for every hour over 40, which means you have to keep track of their work hours every single day and every week, regardless of the fact that you are calling them salaried. So we see a lot of companies that say, well, I'm going to put you as salaried non-exempt or salaried employee, but you still qualify for overtime because they think that's maybe a shortcut to the administrative headaches of tracking time. It's not. So the other thing is you have to also ensure that these employees receive their breaks and a duty-free meal period. In this state, the breaks are 10 minutes paid every 4 hours, and a duty-free meal period 30 minutes minimum after 5 hours. So you still have to ensure that they receive that time in addition to tracking the time that they're working. So the question you got to ask yourself, is this really the right answer, the salaried non-exempt? It does make it more difficult to determine the regular rate, which is basically the number that you multiply times 1.5 to determine the overtime rate. You still have to say to yourself, well, tracking time, do I make deductions for a weekly salary for absences? And if you don't, I got to ask why, because you are really messing with your regular rate when you're paying people even though they aren't at work. And then there's another issue that comes up is like, well, these people have fluctuating work weeks, and I just want to kind of level out their pay. Well, that is a topic for a whole nother seminar, because the fluctuating work week is got pages and pages of regulations and is designed by it's allowed, but it's designed to be used in limited situations that meet specific requirements established by the Department of Labor. So if you have fluctuating work week problems or questions, you're going to have to wait for the fluctuating work week seminar. So the second topic we were going to talk about is compensable time. What do we count as compensable time? What do we rule out as compensable time? So keep in mind that you need to, by law, identify your standard work week. This means the same pay period or work week for every week of the working calendar. Typically, this is maybe a Sunday morning at 12:01 a.m., just past midnight, up until midnight on Saturday night. So 7-day period. Try to get the full week, and so you know when the work week begins and when it ends, because the question is going to be, when did the 40 hours occur? In 1 week or 2? So you have to know when the week begins. Now, the hours worked for overtime purposes in anything that it looks like work, basically. That is, even if you didn't ask for it, if you've allowed it to occur, or if you suffered or permitted, and that's language out of the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning that you accommodated it, you benefited from it, it was work, it wasn't social, it happened, okay? That is time that counts towards the 40 hours and must be paid. If the employee was engaged to wait, so that means that you ask them to stay at the place of employment, for instance, and be ready to go on a moment's notice, even if they're reading a book while they're waiting to be engaged on a moment's notice, you are now engaged to wait. If you're on call on the employee's premises, meaning that if something happens and you're on premises, you have to jump and take that time to respond to whatever's occurring. If you're on call on the employee's premises, that's paid time. Breaks, that's time that's worked. Like I said before, that's 10 minutes every 4 hours. Okay, what does not count? If you're waiting to be engaged, meaning you're free to do whatever, typically you're not even on the employer's premises, and your time is actually up to you, and will not be interrupted. That is not compensable time. The duty-free meal period, not compensable time. Okay, PTO or vacation, that is not compensable time unless obviously you have paid time off, but it doesn't count towards the hours worked for overtime purposes. Even if you're paying them, that's not considered hours worked for overtime purposes. Family Medical Leave Act, the hours on FMLA do not count towards overtime purposes. And any truly voluntary activities do not count for overtime purposes. So for our definition of compensable time that is time that you must pay at least minimum wage for the employee's work. Okay? So work is off the clock. Answering emails after hours is suffered or permitted. That is compensable time. Now let's look at some of the variations here. Training time. If an employee is attending a meeting or training program, that it would not necessarily be considered working time, meaning count towards the 40 hours, or be compensable, of course, unless they're exempt, and then we don't make deductions for this time. But you need to pay people for lectures, meetings, and training programs unless, 1, it is outside normal hours, 2, it's completely voluntary, 3, not job-related, and, not or, and no other work is concurrently being performed. Meaning, if while they're sitting to the lecture, they're also typing up memos, answering emails, stepping out to make phone calls. If those are work-related emails, memos, and phone calls, that's work. Okay? So my general advice on this is usually training, meetings, and lectures are compensable because it's generally kind of difficult to meet these 4 requirements. Another area is travel time. So let's take the example of an employee who works generally at one office in the city, say Tacoma, and is given a special one-day assignment to go to Seattle, and they return home the same day, cursing traffic the whole way, probably. So the time spent in traveling to and returning to the other city from Tacoma to Seattle is work time, except that you can offset that time with the time that the employee would normally spend commuting from their home to the work site. So it's whatever the additional time is that they spend commuting would be compensable. So here's some other travel situations. Travel after you get to your office, you travel from job site to job site during the workday. That's all compensable time and must be counted as hours worked towards the 40 hours. Okay? Now, there's a common question we get. Travel away from home community. And I have to say, out of all the regulations on travel, this one is the least clear. But here's my advice. If you're traveling away from home overnight, then it is clearly work time when it happens during the normal work day. Okay? So you can't put them on the plane and then clock them out. So it's not only hours worked, but it's also if they are traveling on, say their normal hours are 9 to 5. If they're traveling between 9 and 5 on non-working days, say a Saturday or a Sunday, that would also be considered to be compensable time. However, if they are a passenger during the during that travel and it's outside of the regular working hours, say they're on a plane back from wherever they were and they're traveling on a Saturday or a Sunday, which are not typically working hours. If they're a passenger, that is now not working time. Okay, and clearly if they stayed over to conduct personal business, at the point where they begin their personal business, unless they resume doing your business, they're on their own time. So that can also be a cutoff point too, is when they start visiting or sightseeing or visiting with friends. Let's wrap up with a couple of things we've noticed. Folks who are identifying coordinators and specialists as exempt from the Fair Labor Standards Act, meaning they don't get overtime. See this a lot. Generally, it's not appropriate. Keep in mind the employee's primary duties have to include the exercise of independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. And, matters of significance, there's not a list, and those things are you have to take a look at those individually. But if a person's a coordinator and they are basically making sure that a project is getting done and shepherded properly, I got to question whether or not they're going to meet the requirements for the administrative exemption. Here's the other thing we see sometimes, what's the duty-free meal period? Now, a lot of people are surprised to find out that the federal law does not require people to have a duty-free meal period. Federal law does not require people to have a break either. In Washington and most every state, we give them according to state law, and it's also a good idea. But if you have an employee who is using their meal period to remain at the desk, answering phone calls, routing calls, answering email, that is not a duty-free meal period. And now that time must be counted and paid as compensable hours, meaning they count towards the 40 hours per week because they have not been completely relieved of duty. So don't fall into those types of traps. Bracket in the employee's time, because having a duty-free meal period is not just a legal requirement, it's also a nice break for employees. Here's the other thing, interns and trainees. Used to be there was always free interns and you could have trainees, and basically the joke was, well, you could abuse them as much as you want and you didn't have to pay them. That's not true, because the Department of Labor has identified this as a problem area and given us guidance that says these people need to be paid. Okay? If they're being used to substitute for regular workers, like filling in, if they're increasing your existing workforce, if instead of hiring additional employee, you say, well, during the summer we'll just bring on some interns and trainees, and then that's our busy time, so we don't necessarily have to hire people to do that. We'll just have the interns and trainees do that work. Wrong. That interns and trainees aren't volunteers anymore. Okay? And if the interns and trainees basically are responsible for producing work, they need to be paid. Okay? If they're there for their own benefit, meaning they get to walk around and observe stuff, nobody expects them to produce any work product, if it's way more for their benefit to be there and you don't get any real benefit from having that person there, meaning you get no work from them, you don't have any expectations that they step in, and they don't step in, well, that might be truly an unpaid internship. So how do we lead through these changes? IFRAT is going to, from 501 Commons, is going to provide some now helpful guidance for those of you who are going to be implementing these changes to make sure you comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act. IFRAT, and I'll hand the microphone.
Thank you, Mike. On this part of the presentation, we will discuss the organizational plan for communicating the FLSA change. This change has a significant impact on the work life of many employees, and communicating it correctly might have implication on your organizational climate and culture. An important distinction that I would like to begin with is the distinction between information and communication. While information focuses on delivering the messages across accurately, communication aims for the creation of mutual understanding and trusting relationship, which I'm certain is where we want to be. This is the reason why the communication component is so crucial in this process. So let's look at the planning stage. A few questions that we suggest asking yourself as leaders at this stage are, first of all, do you fully understand the change? As Mike described earlier, there are a lot of details involved in the non-exempt classification, and employees will probably have many questions. So before implementing, make sure you understand all the details around this change. Second question to ask would be, does the organization understand the implications on its mission, programs, relationship, culture, budget? In some organizations, this change through a ripple effect impacts the program offerings. In other organizations, it impacts the relationships with funders. It is important to understand the impact on the bigger picture of your organization. Third question to ask would be, how is the organization going to treat overtime? What are the alternatives we have for overtime? Assuming we cannot afford to pay all the overtime we really need, we may need to reshuffle roles and responsibilities, rely more on volunteers, or find other solutions. The next question we need to ask ourselves is what are the main messages regarding this change? It's important to remember that the change to the FLSA salary level was intended to improve employees' lives, pay them more fairly, and close a decade-long gap. So while it might be challenging as an employer, it's important to remember the reasoning behind the change and communicate accordingly. And finally, where do you foresee difficulties? Who would need more support and attention? Some employees might have a harder time than others, and the more you anticipate in advance, the better prepared you are. Let's take our attention towards planning the communication strategy. For that, we suggest using this model, which looks at the communication process at 3 levels: the procedural level, the personal level, and the organizational level. Next, I will describe the considerations for each level. The first level is the procedural level. The question we ask here essentially is, what procedures, if any, need to be created or updated in order to successfully implement the change? In many organizations, time tracking is the main procedure that requires attention. You want to make sure that you have a friendly, usable, and if possible, familiar system in place. You want to make sure that employees and supervisors know how to track time, including breaks, vacation or PTO, after-hours work, and more. You want to make sure that supervisors are comfortable with overseeing timesheets and approving them. For many supervisors, this is a new task which they have not engaged in before, and they will need training on it. Other procedures that your organization might want to look into. Pre-approval of overtime. Who approves overtime in your organization? You will need guidelines around the circumstances when an overtime will be acceptable and approved. For example, Organization X decided that during the week of the preparation for their annual event, they would approve 15% overtime to all staff involved in the preparation. They budget and trained their supervisors accordingly. Another procedure to look at is the approval of unexpected overtime. What happens in the case of crisis when an employee worked overtime without pre-approving? Please note that as an employer you have to pay for all overtime worked even if it wasn't pre-approved. However, how do you handle this at the employee relations level will have great impact on the employee morale and engagement. Yet a third procedure you want to look at is the pre-approval of out-of-town travel, as Mike described before, and professional development activities. There are rules about that, and there is a question of who decides what to approve and for which employee. Remember to update your policies, official documents, and forms. They should reflect the change and convey consistent messages. For example, if your offer letter mentions that the PTO can be taken only in full days increments, and after the reclassification, non-exempt employees can take smaller chunks of time off, you need to update the letter accordingly. Now, let's look at the personal level. The first group you need to take care of are obviously the employees who are impacted by the change. A few points worth mentioning about communicating with them. As much as possible, we suggest to keep the communication personalized. Tailor the message to the recipient or recipients. Some people need to understand the bigger pictures, others prefer only to focus on the information related to them. You are the one who knows your people best, and you can plan accordingly. Start with the individual meeting with affected employees and explain the change. Employees have probably heard rumors about the change by now, and they need to get reliable, personalized information from their leader. Communicate clearly and honestly. Explain the legal background and the steps taken by your organization to plan for this change. And finally, show empathy. This change deals with employees' compensation as well as their levels of flexibility and autonomy. They may react in an emotional way or show signs of distress and confusion. Be empathetic to their situations, show them you care, and as much as possible provide reassurance. The other group that warrants attention in the communication process are the direct supervisors of these reclassified employees. Even though their own classification often does not change, they are your change agents, and their attitude will greatly influence the outcome of your communication process. It's important to acknowledge that a new time-consuming task is added to their already full plate, overseeing time reports and dealing with overtime. For many of them, this is a whole new task, and often it raises questions of trust, authority versus autonomy, and more. We recommend that you find opportunity to discuss this question with the supervisor so that they feel supported by your organization. Furthermore, these supervisors might be the first point of contact for employees' frustration and concerns. The supervisor should be knowledgeable about the change and on board with the organizational messaging in order to convey the appropriate message to their staff. For example, a supervisor who would tell their team member something like, "It's okay, you don't really have to take breaks, just check the box saying you took them," may do a disservice to the organization, as the law requires that employees actually take their breaks. Finally, acknowledge the supervisor's situation and provide ample support, both in the operational and the emotional level. In the organizational level, I would start by asking whether this change really affects the entire organization. Some nonprofit organizations have very few employees who are impacted by the change, while for others, this change impacts the majority of the workforce. The picture is very different for each of these cases. Beyond reclassified employees, you might want to consider whether organizational processes change as the result of the FLSA change. If they do, these changes need to be clearly communicated to staff. Finally, carefully consider your organizational culture and choose the right tools for you. All staff emails, training sessions, newsletters, written Q&As, or something that is unique to your organization. If your staff is used to reading organizational news over the mail, communicate with them electronically. If they are not as tech-savvy, you may consider a more traditional approach to communicating. Some general tips regarding the communication process. We suggest to provide plenty of opportunities for staff and supervisors to discuss the changes, voice their concerns, and express their emotions. As I mentioned before, staff might feel anxious and confused, supervisors might feel overwhelmed, and the best way to deal with these emotions is to air them in a constructive and a respectable way. Make sharing updates and following up with answers your top priority. It's okay not to have all the answers to everyone's question at any given moment. We already know that some aspects of the FLSA are extremely elaborate and complex. That being said, it is crucial that you do find out the answers and follow up with your team on questions they raise. We suggest to use a variety of communication pathways and vehicles. Redundancy and repetition are helpful in creating an effective communication program. It's probably smart to have an all-staff meeting and a written set of frequently asked questions and an email with guidelines or any other combination that fits the needs of your organization. Finally, acknowledge people's different learning style and try to accommodate them. Your visual learners would probably need to look at presentations or infographics, while others may need to learn from examples, scenarios, and stories. Now, let's look shortly beyond the horizon at what happens once the change has been implemented. The first point to mention is that this is an organizational learning process. Mistakes and unexpected outcomes are an inherent part of such a process. Don't panic if the time reporting didn't work out just as you hoped it would, or if not all employees understood the travel policy. As long as we identify the mistakes, fix them, and try to learn from them, things will probably be okay. Follow up with employees and supervisors after the first few payroll runs and check. What worked well? What was challenging? How can we improve the new process? One key element is to move very slowly and gradually from friendly reminders to disciplinary measures for non-approved overtime. Remember that even employees who worked unauthorized overtime did it out of commitment to the organization and its mission. Always pay for time worked and handle the disciplinary level cautiously. Start with friendly reminders, then a little less friendly, and save the extreme measures to extreme cases. After discussing all the aspects of a good communication plan, let's look at this sample plan that Organization X put together. There are a few important points to mention about the process. First, someone in the organization needs to own the implementation and communication process. In this example, it is the ED, but it can be anyone in the leadership team. They should be the ones driving the process forward, making decisions, and holding the organizational knowledge on the issue. Second, not all organizations need to work with HR consultants to support them through the process. However, there are documents and decision points where you might want to reach out to an HR professional or an employment attorney to get some expert advice. And finally, you can see in this example the many different channels the organization chose to communicate with staff and the opportunities provided for them for open discussion and sharing. With that, the only thing left for me to do is to wish you all the best of luck in your FLSA change communication process. We will now take questions.
Okay, I think that, this is Mike again. I think we've received a couple of questions already, and we can kind of go through those. One of the questions that we had earlier in the week was with regard to clergy and whether or not they have to be paid according to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Well, the Constitution of the U.S. separates church and state, and so if a church is going to hire clergy, it can hire clergy under whatever conditions it wants to hire clergy. There's an interesting case in the Ninth Circuit that was actually litigated and tried by one of my colleagues at my firm. And if, for instance, if it's a legitimate clergy member and part of their training is to wash dishes, for example, without being paid for 6 months, that's fine. But so there's a clergy exemption and clergy training exemption for a religious organization. So that was a question we had earlier this week. One of the questions that's come in today would be what suggestions you have for timesheets to make sure that you calculate overtime properly on a semi-monthly payroll. So keep in mind that you need to have identified a work week. So and regardless of when your pay periods are, and they need to be at least once a month, you have to identify the work week, the beginning of the work week and the end of the work week, and that way the 40 hours, if there are time that occurs more than 40 hours within that work week, regardless of the pay period, is what we're looking for. Now, the other suggestion I have on timesheets is there should be something on that timesheet that says that the employee attests or agrees, or whatever word you want to use, swears that they're reporting all their time on this timesheet, that they are have received all of their breaks, and their meals were either they received all their meal periods and things like that. So in addition to kind of signing off on the hours that they worked, you should also have them signing off on the fact that they received breaks and meal periods as required by state law. The best thing to do is have some sort of mechanical clocking in device. You clock in on your computer, that you are the only person who knows the password for, and that you have a policy that says no clocking in or clocking out for other people. Punch cards, I mean, it's an old method, but frankly, it's was invented because it makes sense. So the kind of least favored method of that is just handwritten timesheets. Not to say that it's bad, just they're not as accurate. And if you do have handwritten timesheets, like I say, make sure folks not only attest to the hours they work, but that they receive the breaks and meal period. There was a question about travel time. Somebody said, well, was I saying that if they travel to the event on an airplane on a Saturday, it is compensable, but when they travel back home on a Saturday, it's not? That's not what I was saying. I said that if they travel on an airplane during their normal work day, and if that does not include Saturday, that would not be compensable. So if they travel on a Monday, say they work on Monday through Friday, normal working hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 or 7 to 5 or whatever it is. Okay, if they're on a plane or a train or they're a passenger or they're driving, during that period of time, that's their normal work day, that's not a deduction from their pay. If they come back as a passenger on a Saturday and that's not their normal work day, that is not paid time. So hopefully that'll clear that up. There's another thing. Can I give us examples of training that would not be job related? Yes, I can. If you have somebody who is a counselor, a mental health counselor, and they're attending they take time off and they're attending a class on how to trade stocks. And they go to a stock picking class and how to, read the stock tickers and things like that. That's clearly not work related, not paid time. Okay? So if so you got to look at what's the training about. If it's encouraged or paid for by the employer, and hopefully you're paying for stuff that's relevant to your business, then that's probably paid time. Okay? There's other questions about, kind of wage and hour, like meals and breaks. If they get a duty-free meal period, half hour by state law, and they work from 9 to 5:30, so that's 8.5 hours, are they within their 40 hours and have not done any overtime? Yeah, if they work 5 days a week times 8 hours a day, that's 40 hours, no overtime. Now, another question we always get about breaks is, can we stack breaks? Can somebody, put their breaks at the end of the day and leave early? Absolutely not. That is, you cannot waive your breaks. Unless you're in the construction, well, you cannot waive your breaks no matter who you are, okay? So in the state of Washington, 10 minutes if you're working 4 hours or longer, you have a 10-minute break that has to occur no later than 3 hours after the beginning of your shift, okay? So it's very, very prescriptive. That does not mean I'm going to take my 10-minute breaks, combine them, and I'm going to leave 20 minutes early at the end of the day. That does not cut it. And from my experience, it all works out until somebody gets mad, and then there's a wage claim for all those missed breaks. So don't risk that stuff. Just follow the rules. And the other thing is, like, people always ask, well, can I move my meal period? Meal periods are different than breaks. Actually, if you have an agreement with your employee that they want to move their meal period to the end of the day, that's actually permitted by law, because the law, the way it's written, says employers must permit a meal period within, if for any employee that works more than 5 hours. Now, if you're not forbidding it and you said you could take it, but they don't want to, that's fine. Here's my advice. Get that waiver in writing from the employee. Get it written down that says, I do not want to take my meal period until I've been here 7.5 hours, and then I will take my meal period at that time. And then they leave, right? So get it in writing. and the first time they come to you and say, I don't want to do that anymore, I want a meal period, you know, during the day, rip up that piece of paper and make sure they get a meal period during that day. So hopefully those are some of the questions. Efrat, I think there were some questions for you too.
So we were asked either a legal way to prevent employees from working overtime and what can be done in order to discipline them. So no, there is no legal way to prevent employees from working overtime, and employer has to pay for any time worked by their employees, regardless whether it was or was not pre-approved by the employer. However, dealing with unapproved overtime is a matter that goes back to your organizational culture, your policies, and the way you present it to employees. Any disciplinary action you take has to be documented and pre-documented in your written policies, and we strongly recommend that it starts with friendly reminders, because oftentimes people would work unauthorized overtime due to their own commitment to the organizational mission and their own work. So acknowledge that and remind them in a very friendly way. We cannot afford this overtime, and we ask them not to repeat it. You can do 1 or 2 or 3 friendly reminders, and that's up to you and depends on your organizational cultures. You can move from that to write up, if these are parts of your written policy, performance improvement plan, if that is in your policy, up to termination. However, the termination would not be due to working overtime, it would be a termination due to disobedience and a disciplinary problem, because repeatedly working unauthorized overtime is basically a disciplinary issue.
Okay, hey, we got a couple other questions. One was regarding, well, do I need to, you know, if they're actually volunteering or it's non-required attendance, what do I need to pay them? And what really means, what is the definition of, you know, volunteering your time? Well, that means, you know, and I always kind of look at, well, the office holiday party. You're free to attend or not. No attendance will be taken. Your absence or attendance at the function has absolutely no effect on your employment. You are not responsible for the information that's covered in that meeting, and the information, if any, that's covered in that meeting will not be necessary for you to do your job. Okay? And if the person comes to that type of meeting, or like I say, a holiday function or after work get together, heck, it could just be like meeting happy hour on a Thursday afternoon. You don't have to come. Nothing of consequence will happen. That's not paid time. That is not hours worked. Hopefully that clears that up. Question of pay for interns. I mean, if you do have to pay for interns, is a stipend okay? It is fine. You still have to track their hours and make sure they meet the minimum wage requirements. So track the interns' hours, because they're definitely not going to meet any of the requirements for an exemption from overtime. So track their hours, and if you pay them a stipend, make sure the stipend is sufficient when it's averaged out over the hours that they work to meet minimum wage requirements. And then don't let them work more than 40 hours a week, because that just creates problems. Yeah, so were there other questions? Oh, comp time. Comp time. Yes, people always want to know about comp time. Okay. Fred, do you want to talk about this?
No, I will give you the pleasure.
Yeah. So unless you are a government employee, like meaning you work for the federal or state government, you do not have the ability to swap overtime pay for time off. Okay? You cannot waive your rights to be paid time and a half after 40 hours by receiving additional time off or comp time. So if you do that practice, you do that at your own peril, and I don't want to hear about it because I understand it occurs, but it is not acceptable practice unless you're a public employee. So, yeah, sorry to rain on people's parade on that one.
Can I add something about comp time?
Yeah.
You have a flexibility within the work week. So if an employee worked 7 hours one day and 9 hours on the other day, or vice versa, within the same work week, this is acceptable. However, if an employee worked 43 hours one work week, they cannot compensate for it by working 37 hours on the next work week. That is comp time, and that is unacceptable.
Right. And there's great points, Efrat, because we do not have a daily overtime statute in this state. And so, you know, if somebody did work 10 hours one day, and they're normally an 8-hour-a-day person, they can take 2 hours off the next day, and so they stay underneath the 40 hours per week. It has to all be accomplished within the same work week, which is why you need to identify your work week. If they worked 10 hours on the last day of the work week, and that puts them at 42 hours for that week, you will now pay them 2 hours of overtime because you cannot give them time off the next day, which falls into the next work week, because that can only be done within one work week. Okay, so the question is, if you don't work 40 hours a week, is the employer not obliged to pay full pay? Well, here's the thing, is the law says overtime after 40. If your normal work week is 37 and a half, unless you have an agreement that's between you and your employees, that means you, like if they work 38 or 39 or 39 and a half or 40, that's still straight time until they get to 40 hours. Just because you've identified the work week as 37 and a half doesn't mean that they get overtime after 37 and a half, unless that's what you want to do. By law, you're not required to until they hit 40, anytime after 40 hours. So hopefully that clears that up too. And hopefully I understood the question.
Thank you so much for all your questions, and thank you, Mike and Efrat, for sharing such valuable information and providing guidance to help organizations plan for the change. With only 20 days left to December 1st, time to act is now. Please note that webinar recording will be made available on 501 Commons website, where you can also access a lot of other resources, including link to overtime calculator and a workbook with information and checklist to assist you in planning for this rule change. If you need any further HR professional assistance, please fill the request for assistance form available on 501 Commons website, or send an email with your specific question to hrconsults@501commons.org. Again, the email address is hrconsults@501commons.org. You will receive a short survey to provide feedback on today's webinar. Your feedback will help us improve our offerings in future. So please do take out a few minutes to share it. Thank you everyone for your participation. Have a wonderful day ahead.